This is what it is. Up to 28. Winston, would you please give the opening statement shortly?
I would be happy to, except I think, is Jonah on?
Not yet.
Not
Yes,
yet?
he just came in. I see him.
Okay, I think he, as the project leader, I can introduce Jonah, and then Jonah can, well, sorry, I don't have my video on. There we go. So I can certainly introduce Jonah, but I want Jonah to introduce the presentation, unless Jonah wants me to do the full honors.
Okay.
And I see a number of other city planning folks here that are joining us.
Okay, before we go full blast, I hope this is not an exercise in if. This is definitely going forward. The new mayor is going to do as we ask, because you're going to tell him to do it, right, Winston?
Oh, sure, sure.
Seriously.
Yes, all of that. Here's
Yes.
Jonah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're going to see a wonderful presentation this evening. We have Winston Von Engel on the line, Brooklyn Borough Director, and we have Jonah Rogoff, team leader for the MCROWN neighborhood rezoning, and this is part of the kickoff process as we head towards putting ULURP on paper. And we are going to, Jonah will tell you about the presentation. Take it away, Jonah. You gotta unmute yourself.
Go ahead, Jonah.
Thanks. So first, I just want to take a moment to thank you, Ethel, Gibb, and many others from CB8 for the opportunity to present tonight, for hosting the event, and just continuing to partner with us. Everyone can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Great. So we're really happy to be here. As you know, this is really a team effort, and tonight's work is really being led by Amy Jin. We're also joined by a few other team members, including Connie Chan, Jesse Hirakawa, and then I think a few others. And Lara Marita, our Director of Neighborhood Studies. And Sarit Plotkin, who's been greatly supporting our work here as well.
Alex as well.
Yes, and Alex, of course. So before I turn it over to Amy, I just want to give everyone an update of where we are with the study and how tonight's work fits in. So I think the last time we met was in late summer, in August. And since that period of time, we've given a lot of thought to how we can continue outreach, how we can continue planning for MCROWN, just given the uncertainty and the inability to move forward with a full area-wide rezoning in this administration. And we've given this a lot of thought, and the approach that we've come up with, which I believe we've mentioned to some, but I just wanted to frame it for everybody, is to really lay a strong foundation for our engagement work, specifically with respect to providing background about land use, really focusing on population and demographic work. So we've come up with kind of three broad topics, starting with population, demographic trends, and also housing. And then we hope to come back to present on capital planning and infrastructure planning, as well as information about land use and zoning. and massings in particular. So we'll be setting aside dates in the upcoming months, but I just wanted to give everyone a sense of the direction that we're heading. And so I think there are really two main goals that we have for today. First and foremost, we just want to share the population and demographic trends. This is not only an important part of our existing conditions work that we do as planners, but it's also just an important foundation that informs our work, given the focus on jobs and housing in MCROWN. We wanted to take a step back and really examine what we're seeing, and also how that relates to the current trends of COVID, which we know has been very impactful within the in Brooklyn and across the country, if not in the world. So we're also we've divided the presentation into two parts. So the first one is focused on citywide trends, and then we'll take a break in the middle for questions, just given the length of the presentation. And then the second part is devoted entirely to the local trends in and around MCROWN. And so with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Thanks, Jonah. All right, let me share this presentation with everybody. Does everyone see the presentation?
Looks good to me.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so let's get started. So as Jonah said, we're first going to take a look at the citywide trends. So that consists of population growth, and then we're going to look at job growth, and then looking at housing affordability, and then moving on to racial composition and the changes of the city. And then lastly, we're going to end with the impacts of COVID and some equity issues. And that's sort of the first portion of our presentation. Just a note before we start, DCP recognizes the imperative need to address longstanding racial and social inequities that the most vulnerable New Yorkers have long faced. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated those inequities. Many neighborhoods have suffered disinvestment, including from the city, especially when it comes to basic amenities that are meant to sustain communities' health and well-being, such as parks, sports fields, pharmacies, and health centers. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, DCP and other city agencies are identifying opportunities to prioritize equity, safety, and well-being of all New Yorkers. The data presented here today was collected before the current COVID-19 pandemic. We recognize that New York City's population and employment has been greatly impacted by the pandemic, and we expect to see that reflected in future data. So we're going to start very broad first. So we're going to look at population growth over the last 100 years. So pre-pandemic, New York City's population was at a historic high. Population growth has slowed in recent years. So we had rapid growth through 1950, as you can see on the graph here. And then between 1950 and 1970, the population was relatively stable, but there were many demographic changes in those 20 years. And we'll take a look at that in the next few slides. There was a sharp drop in population in the 70s. As we all know, there was a citywide economic crisis, followed by the flight of the middle class. And then from 1980 onwards, there was population growth, and we recovered most of that population loss by 2000. And since 2000, there has been a lot of growth, and that growth has been beyond the historical peak. So as I said, there has been slowdown in recent years of population growth. The extent of that slowdown is still unclear. Recent and future federal immigration policies, of course, impact that growth. And what we're seeing right now with the pandemic, that's obviously going to impact growth as well. So we're going to take a look at what makes population growth. These are the components that contribute to population growth, and I'll go through each of the bars with you. The green bar here is total population change, and that's made up of natural increase and net migration. So the blue bar here is natural increase, and what that means is births minus deaths. And we can see that the blue bar here is positive, so there are more births than there are deaths. The orange bar here is showing net migration, and net migration can be broken down into the yellow and the red bar underneath. The yellow bar represents net international migration, which, as I mentioned before, is impacted by federal policies that sort of govern over international migration. Here we can see the yellow bar is positive, which means that there are more people from outside the country moving into New York City than there are people from New York City moving out of the city into another country. And then the red bar here is net domestic migration. And net domestic migration just means people moving within the country, but into the city and out of the city. So here we see the red bar is negative, and that means that there are more people from the city leaving to other parts of the country than there are people from other parts of the country moving into the city. So the take home from this presentation here, from this slide here, is that New York City's population depends on natural increase and net international migration to sustain its population. We're going to take a very quick look here on the population and how it's changed. So as population grew over the last 100 years, it also became more diverse. We'll take a closer look at that change later on. So people in the city might feel that the population here is growing really rapidly, but placed in context, the growth in the city is actually only a third of the country's. So you can see here, the city has been seeing a fairly steady growth of about 2%. Meanwhile, the metro region in between 2000 and 2010 grew by about 4%, excluding New York City. In that same time period, so from 2000 to 2010, the country grew by 9.7%, which is almost five times faster than New York City. In the more recent decade, we've seen a slowdown of growth in the metro region, but the growth in the country is still outpacing that of the city. And then we're also going to take a look at net international migration. So over the last 4 years, there's been a slowdown of net international migration, which is influenced by federal immigration policies. So we can see here that from 2016 onwards, the slope drops. A few slides ago, we looked at how much of New York City's population depended on net international migration. International migration is what keeps our city. All right, and then so we're going to look at the economy now. So pre-pandemic, employment was at a record high in the city. There were about 10.4 million jobs in the region in 2017, and population and jobs were the densest at the center, which is New York City. Job growth drives in-migration and keeps the population from leaving. And so the workforce in the region, which is about 12 million pre-pandemic, is larger than that of Boston, San Francisco, and Seattle metro regions combined. And we can see here on the like country map on the right, although New York City's metro region's growth saw a 1.1% annual increase. And so other cities like San Francisco and Dallas grew at a faster rate. We actually added the most absolute number of jobs. So you can see here that it's 4,000 jobs, which is greater than all the other metro regions in the country. So pre-COVID, New York City gained over 660,000 jobs since 2010, with growth in almost every sector and significant job. The highest growth was seen in the office-based healthcare, accommodations, and food service sectors. This was the longest economic expansion on record, and wages were high and rising. Percentage-wise, Brooklyn had grown the fastest, and with the pandemic that we faced in the last 9 months, there have been tremendous impacts on those sectors that were growing the fastest. So again, they were the office market and education, healthcare, and food service. So then we're also looking at how that sort of matches up with housing units permitted. We as planners care a lot about the growth of housing and jobs and how they relate to each other. Gaps or mismatches in that growth becomes a real issue. So housing production hasn't kept pace with employment growth on a year-to-year basis. And of course, we understand that it's not a one-for-one thing, right? Like one job doesn't equal one housing unit needed. But as you can see here on the graph, the blue bars represent job growth and the orange bars represent housing units permitted. And there's been a real gap between those two. What this means is that more people are gaining employment in the city, but there's not enough housing in the city for all of them to live in. And that sort of results in rising demand for housing, which then results in increases in prices. This also can result in people needing to live together, and we'll look at that a little bit more later. So as we mentioned in the last slide, when there's not enough housing, demand rises, and as a consequence, rental prices increase. So here, the blue line represents median gross income median gross rent to income ratio. And that ratio is the highest it's ever been on record. The orange line here represents 30%. 30% is the standard that we typically use to represent affordable housing. So if your rent is less than 30% of your gross income, then your housing is considered affordable. So the ratio here in the blue line, you can see, has steadily increased for the last 50 years. In 2017, more than half of renter households were rent burdened. And we know that rent burden is deeply inequitable and disproportionately affects people who are low income. A record number of people, even among New Yorkers with full-time employment, are experiencing homelessness. And that homelessness is also deeply inequitable. In 2018, 95% of families with children in homeless shelters were people of color, largely Black and Hispanic. And in particular, in the last 9 months, because of the pandemic, a lot of people have lost their jobs, which has exacerbated rent burden issues. And we know that the ratio is high in some of the poorest areas of the city. People in those areas are severely rent burdened. So we looked at this very quickly earlier, so I want to come back to this. New York City's population has grown and changed a lot, and it's become more diverse over the last 50 years. And in the 2012-2016 ACS, the American Community Survey, New York City's population is comprised of 32% white non-Hispanic, 29% Hispanic, 22% Black non-Hispanic, 14% Asian Pacific Islander, and 3% other. Here we can see that the white population has decreased in its share of the overall population over the last 50 years. The Hispanic and Asian populations have increased significantly, while the Black population has remained largely stable. And so here, this is the citywide change in share of the white population. So the areas that are blue are areas where the share of white population has increased from 1990 to 2012, 2016. And the areas that are red are areas where the share of white population has decreased in the last 30 years. This is looking at the Black population of the city. So areas in blue have seen a decrease in the share of Black residents, and areas in green are areas that have seen an increase in the share of Black population. And then lastly, this is the change in share of Hispanic population. Areas in that blue teal color are areas that have seen a decrease in the share of the Hispanic population, while areas in yellow are areas that have seen an increase in the Hispanic population. And what that results in is this kind of a map. So each dot represents 100 New Yorkers. And what this shows is that New York City is incredibly diverse, but it's also very, very segregated. So in the last 9 months, equity challenges have been exacerbated as the pandemic has disproportionately impacted vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. Telework capability is uneven across the city based on a number of factors, including occupation and access to proper childcare. Health and economic impacts have been higher in areas with more service and essential workers who cannot work from home. So the map that we see here on the right is a map that represents subway ridership by turnstile swipes during the pandemic. The larger the dot is, the more people in those areas are traveling. So this is compared to the same period. This was over a course of a week, and this is compared to the same time in 2019. This map is, in other words, you can think of this map as representing the areas where essential workers in the city live. We also wanted to look at COVID impacts while we're talking about equity. So there is some correlation in parts of southern Brooklyn, northern and southeastern Queens, and parts of the Bronx with areas that are experiencing overcrowding, which is the map that you can see on the right here. And a crowded unit here is defined as having more than 2 people per bedroom. So all of this and more can be found in the Where We Live NYC report that HPD has released recently. I will take a break here. I encourage everyone to read this report, not right now, but this concludes the first half of the presentation. I'm not sure how long of a break we want to take, maybe like 5-10 minutes to take any questions, and then we can continue on with the more local trends of MCROWN.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate that. I would ask Gib to curate the questions in the chat. And once those questions have been answered, we can move on to part 2. Okay? Okay, Amy?
Yep, sounds great.
Thank you, Ethel. I'm gonna just maybe start with my question, which was, I noticed that on slide 15 that talks about changes in the Hispanic population, the bullet points seem to reference white population, not Hispanic population. those slides had some good information in them, but we went kind of quickly through them. I wonder if we might just take a quick look back at that, and especially that slide that was talking about Hispanic population.
Oh, you're right. I'm looking at it right now. Yes, you're right. I will make the corrections before we share this slide with you guys.
I see that Kathy Islin has asked the question if there are average compensation data available for the growth in jobs from 2010 to 2017.
This is Winston. We can certainly look into that. We don't have that obviously at our fingertips right now. Just for everybody's information, the information on jobs was the source for it is on our website. Or if you look at planning and regional planning, there are 2 reports on job growth in New York City and in the metropolitan region.
And I think the compensation data would probably be in ACS as well, although trying to get average across everything may be a little bit challenging.
I put a link to the Geography of Jobs report that Winston's referencing in the chat if anyone wants to see it.
Are there any other questions from the chat? I don't see any more being posted. Maybe we can go on with the next part of the presentation.
Well, I just want to test one statement that the work availability of work depending on childcare and the type of work that the person does, telework capability. I would think that it would depend mainly on the availability of broadband. Okay, and then whether or not the worker can afford access to broadband. So that is going to, in my mind's eye, continue to be an issue as we go forward, because Wi-Fi is not going to be able to carry the increased load. As far as I can see, as we mentioned earlier, before most people joined, Google was down for 45 minutes today, along with its PayPal station. So that can continue to become a problem with the new demand, the volume of new demand that's happening. And since there's nothing else in the chat, I ask Amy to go on with the second half of.
Sure. So on your point about broadband, yes, I completely agree with you. The availability of internet that can be used effectively to do your job is really important. The study that we referenced for telework capability took surveys of jobs and asked workers to sort of characterize their jobs by like their tasks. And they grouped the ones where if people say like most of my tasks are done outdoors or I don't use email a whole lot at work, those are kind of the jobs that they categorize as ones that you can't do from home. And so it was looking at sort of the characteristics of your job and whether you're able to work from home to begin with. So like if you had broadband but you work in one of these jobs, it wouldn't matter anyway, right? But I definitely hear you.
But I thought the framework of the question was telework capability, but we can move on.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Give me 1 second. Everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so moving on to the neighborhood trends agenda, we're going to be looking at population growth, age, household composition, race, income, education, and industry. Most of our data is sourced from the decennial census and the ACS. The main difference between the two is that the decennial census is a count and the ACS is an estimate. So wherever possible, we try to use the decennial census, and then we use the ACS to supplement the years in between. So we used a quarter-mile context area for our study for statistical reliability, which includes parts of CD3, 6, and 2 on top of CD8. The study area is at the intersection of 3 districts, so we felt that it was very important to look at trends in the neighboring areas. And throughout the next dozen or so slides, we're going to be comparing a lot of the trends with trends in CD2, 3, 8, and 9, just so that we can see what's happening in the area at large. Before we begin, we feel that a demographic study is a part of a broader look at the role of zoning and land use regulations. And so we looked at areas in the neighborhood that have been rezoned in the last 20 years, and areas that have had historic district designations. So there have been a number of contextual area-wide rezonings in this neighborhood, which is represented in green here. Short of a couple of significant upzonings, such as downtown Brooklyn, 4th Avenue, and then there are small pockets around the other neighborhoods. Most of the rezonings have been contextual, and contextual rezonings tend to limit housing growth capacity. And then all the areas that you see here in blue are areas that have been designated as historic districts. And those areas as well, historic district designation sort of limits growth capacity as well. In the area outlined in red, that is the MCROWN study area that we know and love. And of note here on this map, CD9, which is down here, if you can see where my cursor is, CD9 has seen no area-wide rezonings in the last 30 years. And in the next couple of slides, we'll see how that's affected trends. So we'll start broad again. Looking at the last 50 years, the context area's population was the highest in 1970 at around 130,000. And in the 1970, following Citywide Trends, there was a sharp decrease of 29%. This was due to citywide economic downturn and the flight of the middle class that we talked about in the first half of this presentation. In the 1980s, there was a 12% increase in population, and a lot of that can be attributed to immigration from the Caribbean and Latin America. In particular, between 1980 and 86, there was an influx of immigrants from Guyana, Jamaica, and Haiti. There was a slight decrease in population in the 1990s and early 2000s, and of course, 9/11 and the recession in the 2000s really affected population growth. From 2010 to 2014, 2018, we have seen an 8% increase in the context area here. Most of that has been domestic migration, which is similar to Citywide Trends, and part of that can be attributed to Pacific Park. This growth, this 8% growth, is faster than that of CD8, of Brooklyn, and of the city. And so we wanted to also compare that to the neighboring districts. So as I mentioned before, there was an 8% increase. And between that time, CD8 had a similar growth rate of about 7%. Meanwhile, CD3, Bedford-Stuyvesant, saw a 22% increase, while CD2, which is downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, Brooklyn Heights, saw a 23% increase. Those two districts grew at about 3 times faster than our context area here. And then we can see here also that CD9, Prospect Lefferts Gardens, didn't have any growth and actually decreased, had a very slight decrease of 0.1%. And then, so we wanted to look at age distribution in the area. Proportionally, the context area has more young adults, aged 20 to 39, and fewer children and adolescents than the other geographies of CD8, of Brooklyn, and of the city. The age group of 40 to 59 are about the same, and there are slightly fewer seniors, but not by a whole lot. Here, I want to remind everyone that citywide trends point to a population in the city that is aging. Median age is increasing every year, and more people are staying in the city than before. What that means is that in a few decades, we're in for a challenge that we're going to have to face with this increase of seniors. So seniors have different needs. They may be less able to get around, and our neighborhoods are not well equipped for their needs. And so in a couple of years, a decade or two, our environment is going to pose a real challenge for the seniors in our neighborhoods. We also took a look at non-family households. So a non-family household, as the name suggests, is a household that comprises of people who aren't related in any way, that live together, and they tend to live together because it allows them to share housing costs. And this is a reflection of the high cost of living in the city. So in the context area, there are about 26,000 non-family households, and that was a 4% increase from previous estimates. So here we're comparing 2006-2010 ACS data to 2014-2018 data. So in the context area, non-family households make up 54% of all households. And that saw a 4% increase, as I previously mentioned. Other districts have had a greater increase in non-family households that range from 16 to 29%, but their share is still smaller than that of the context area. Only CD2 has a comparable 54% share of non-family households. So we also wanted to look at demographic change in race. And as we see here from this graph, as the population grew, the demographics of the context area have changed significantly since 1990. In 1990, the context area population was over 3/4 Black, which is represented in green here, and under 12% white non-Hispanic. Since 1990, the Black non-Hispanic population has decreased by 43% and now comprise of just over 40% of the overall context area. And during that same period, the white population went from 12% of the share of the population to just under 40%. While there have been growth in the Hispanic and the Asian populations in the context area, they still remain a minority here. So the share of the context area's population that is Black non-Hispanic is 1/3 less than that of CD8, which is about 58%. yet a third higher than that of Brooklyn, which is about 30%, and nearly double that of the citywide share. The context area's white non-Hispanic population is nearly double that of CD8 and follows Brooklyn and Citywide Trends. And the context area has a smaller proportion of Hispanic and Asian populations compared to Brooklyn and New York City. So with that graph that we saw earlier, we wanted to take a closer look at the change in the Black population here and in the neighboring districts. So from 2006-2010 to 2014-2018, the Black non-Hispanic population has decreased by about 20% in the context area. The share of the Black non-Hispanic population has decreased in the context area at a higher rate than that of CD8, 9, and 3. Only CD2 didn't see a decrease, as you can see by the two bars on the far right of the CD2 cluster. But if we look further back in time to 1990, we see that there has been a decrease in CD2. This sort of ties back to citywide trends. There's no conclusive single cause for this decline, but we do see a lot of movement of different groups citywide, as we saw in the slides before, and we've seen a decline in natural increase in the Black population citywide. We also see sort of an aging out of the population of Black and white share in the city. All right. Sorry, give me 1 second while I have a drink of water. Okay, so we're going to look at household income next. So we're comparing 2006-2010 data to 2014-2018 data here. From these two pie charts, you can see that median household income has increased from $62,000 to $81,000 in the context area. And that median household income of $81,000 is higher than that of Brooklyn and of New York. And households earning $100,000 or more has increased by 69% of total numbers, which is about 8,000 households from 2006-2010 to 2014-2018. Households earning between $50,000 to $100,000 remain stable, while households earning under $50,000 decreased by about 25%. So then we're comparing that to the other geographies. As we mentioned in the previous slide, the context area's median household income was $81,000. The CD8's median household income is $52,000. Brooklyn's is $56,000, and the citywide median is $60,000. So I want to draw your attention on this bar graph to the far left cluster here. So the category of less than $25,000. We can see here that the context area has a smaller proportion of households earning less than $25,000 compared to all the other geographies. Meanwhile, CD8 has the highest proportion of households earning less than $25,000. We're going to skip onto the far right cluster here now. We can see here that the context area has the highest proportion of households earning over $100,000, while CD8 has the smallest proportion of households earning over $100,000 compared to the other geographies. And what this all means is that the context area isn't really representative of the larger district, and the context area has a higher percentage of high-income earners. We also looked at percent of households living under the poverty line, comparing that change from 2006-2010 to 2014-2018. So 11% of the households in the context area live under the poverty line. And this is half as many households living in poverty as CD8 and a lower rate than that of Brooklyn and New York City. So in the context area, we saw a change from 15% to 11%. In CD8, we saw a change of 23% to 20%. In Brooklyn, it went from 19 to 17, and New York City, it sort of stayed stable at 16%. And I just want to note here that the context area has the lowest rate of all the geographies and half as many as CD8. We also looked at educational attainment change. There are 4 categories here. The first category is less than high school. The second one is high school, and then moving on to some college or an associate's degree, and then the last category is a bachelor's degree or higher. Oh God, sorry. The group the group with a bachelor's degree or higher, the share of that group went from 47% in 2006-2010 to 58% of the population in the context area. Meanwhile, there was a slight decrease in numbers of people holding less than a bachelor's degree, so the less than high school, the high school, and some college associate's degree. Those categories, if you see the numbers in the brackets, those saw a slight decrease, but it saw a more pronounced decrease in the overall share of the population. And what that indicates to us is that the majority of the population growth has been of people with a bachelor's degree. And so we also wanted to compare that with the neighboring districts. So 59% of the population in the context area has a bachelor's degree or higher, and this is higher than that of CD8, 3, and 9, and comparable to that of CD2. This is a 42% increase from the previous 2006-2010 estimate. And this rate of increase is actually slower than that of CD3, of CD8 and CD9, and is comparable to that of CD2. But what's important to note here is that the areas of slower comparable growth rates are areas that had higher shares to begin with, whereas the neighborhoods that had higher rates of increase had lower bases to start with. So if you look at CD3, for example, there was a 101% increase, but that's also because there was a 21% share to begin with, which is lower than the other districts. We also looked at occupations held by people who lived in the context area. So there are about 65,000 employed civilians over the age of 16 who live in the context area, and the majority of them from this graphic here, you can see work in 2 industries, and that in healthcare and office-based and professional management. This is similar to Citywide Trends that we saw earlier. These are the 2 industries that grew, that saw rapid growth. And then, so that consists of about 45%, 46% of the overall population in the context area, while the other half of the population work in these, the remaining categories. Just want to note here that many of these categories, particularly education, healthcare, arts, entertainment, and food services, were really hard hit by COVID. And this graph was put together with the help of CB8's very own Gib Viconi. So thank you very much for this. This is looking at change in occupations held by residents. So we're looking at time. So we looked back in the last 20 years of all the occupations held by residents who live in the context area. And what this actually shows is that there hasn't been significant change in the types of jobs that are held by the residents who live here. The most significant one is in the office-based professional and management category, where you can see this increase here, especially in from 2010 to 2018. And so we're at the end of the presentation. A few key takeaways. The population of New York City is continually changing and is influenced by numerous factors that are often interrelated. New York City, especially Brooklyn and Manhattan, had gained a significant number of jobs since 2010. As we saw in this presentation, citywide housing production has not kept up with the significant job growth in the area, leading to increased demand and rising housing costs. On a citywide level, there hasn't been significant amounts of housing built since the mid-century. The decline in population that we saw in the 1970s and 80s decreased some of the housing demand in the periods that followed, but population growth has since caught up and is now at an all-time high. Despite the ongoing construction of Pacific Park, the big picture is that there's still a housing shortage, especially in Brooklyn and in the context area, and limited opportunities to grow nearby. Between 2000 and 2018, the context area's population grew by 8%, increasing pressure on residential displacement. Within the context area and surrounding neighborhoods, there have been significant changes in race, household income, and educational attainment at rates higher than that of the borough and the city. The pandemic may influence future population and demographic trends, as many households within the context area remain vulnerable to infection and the economic impacts associated with the pandemic. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing inequities across the city and has disproportionately affected Black, Latinx, immigrant, and low-income New Yorkers in the neighborhoods that they call home. That concludes my presentation for tonight. I am happy to take any questions that you may have, or any comments, or any clarifications that you want to have.
Thank you, Amy. That was very insightful and informative. As you said, there are a lot of influences that we can't track as carefully or directly to what we would like to see happen in MCROWN. But I do want to say that based on what you've shown us, we should be setting a target based on the stability over the past 20 years of that changes in population. I strongly suspect that the difference in income is from people who could no longer afford rents in Manhattan moving to a part of Brooklyn that would give them a half-an-hour ride to a job in Midtown or in the financial district. But that's just my opinion. I'd like to hear from some of the other members of the audience as to what they think these numbers should lead us to as we work with DCP to plan for this rezoning.
Could I make one comment to get us started? I wanted to just bear down a little bit on the change in Black population in the context area versus the city overall, because I think when we heard the presentation of the city population overall over the last several decades, the Black population was fairly stable. I think it was described as being fairly stable, but that's not been the case in the study area at all. The study area shows significant displacement of African Americans since 1990, it's not participating in a greater city trend. Something else is happening in the study area, And I tend to agree with Ethel. It has something to do with the change in housing costs, since clearly we see a population of people who are more likely to work in managerial and professional jobs, have college degrees, they earn, income is going up, and all of those things feed into housing costs. I don't know if you all had an opportunity to consider that particular, any correlation of that change in demographic, but it's been a very significant one in this part of Brooklyn.
Those of you in the audience who live in North Prospect Heights and live in or near the study area, this is your opportunity to ask questions and speak up and provide comments. So please take this opportunity.
May I, Ms. Tynes, may I just point something out, if I could, about what Gib just said, which is that if you recall the map of that Amy showed in the beginning, the first half of Citywide Trends, in terms of where the share of the different population types had increased and decreased. There is a change taking place. The share of the Black population did in fact decrease in Prospect Heights, here in Crown Heights and Prospect Heights. It also decreased in other areas. It decreased in places like the southwestern Bronx, as well as northern Manhattan and Harlem, and other places in Queens. But there is a larger, there you are, right? So overall, it is where, in each case, and it increased in places like in Canarsie and Marine Park and northern portions of the Bronx. So the change in population and the loss in the Black population in some of these areas is due to a number of different reasons. Some of it may be housing costs. Others may be the aging out of population, or other different reasons. But there are numerous reasons why people leave, including being that the housing costs are too high.
Hi, this is Burnell. I just wanted to chime in here, and hello, Amy. Just following up on what Gib has said, just wondering too, in terms of the stats, how many of the buildings are under rent stabilization versus not? Because what our experience, at least at Impact Brooklyn, has been, there's been quite a bit of, in terms of the owners. One, if it's not in a rent stabilized sort of building, that the prices were escalating. And then even in the rent stabilized, some people just didn't, new people moving in didn't realize that the rents, you know, that they were in rent stabilized buildings. But I'm just wondering also in terms of the housing stock and the opportunity to be pushed out.
Thank you for
So
that.
I guess that's a question, whether there's any data on that.
Amy, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And we are taking a closer look at the housing data with the help of HPD in the upcoming meetings that we have later, like early next year, so in January-ish. You can see Addison here, who just waved earlier. He's from HPD. So hopefully at that presentation, we're able to sort of parse out these things that you're talking about.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from Addison. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Burnell. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, I hope to be able to answer that. in the new year.
Okay, very good.
And please share that information with Community Board 8 as well. I think that's going to be very important to us looking prospectively at rezoning in the MCROWN district.
So we'll be touching on part of this going forward, and we back and forth with HPD and DCP. As District Manager George mentioned earlier, there is on the calendar a meeting on Thursday with HPD for the projects that they're planning in CD8. So they sort of dovetail in a way. I hope you will all be able to join those meetings going forward. We're planning for additional meetings on MCROWN for community outreach going forward into January. And we'll be working with Winston and Jonah to set up dates for that. Those dates will be published on the CB8 calendar with the links in the description of the discussion. So I'm looking for, okay, there's a question from Erin Eastwood. How do you think all the units coming online from Atlantic Yards will affect the local trends in population, average income levels, etc.? You want to take that one?
I don't hear a lot of people jumping at the chance on that. Let me get the ball rolling, and then I'll pass it on to Amy and Winston and Jonah. Atlantic Yards, according to its EIS, should add about 13,500 people to its project footprint as an add to the neighborhood. With neighborhood today of about 20,000 people. So it's a very, ultimately when all the buildings, and if all the buildings are built, it's a very substantial new population. Personally, given what we have seen in terms of the affordability levels of the affordable units that's come on, and especially in terms of what we're seeing with the buildings that are under construction and will have affordable housing in them, I think that I would expect the growth in Atlantic Yards to be consistent with the profile of growth that Amy has gone through in the study area. That tends to be higher income households and largely white.
Thank you, Gib. That's a logical conclusion from the data we've seen so far. So
I'd be interested to hear if the DCP folks have any comment on that, because I think it's an excellent question.
So, Gib, you're absolutely right. A lot of clearly that's going to be a huge increase in population for those new developments, and it's a variety of incomes that will be part of Pacific Park. But I think one of the things we wanted to show, and we knew that Pacific Park was going to be popping in some of our analysis for the study area as well, which is why one of the reasons we included a larger geography and compared it to other surrounding neighborhoods, because we wanted to understand. We didn't want to just analyze Pacific Park as part of the study area, but we wanted to see how it compared to downtown Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, and other portions of Crown Heights. And I think some of the data that Amy showed was that those areas experienced similar trends that even the tracts that included Pacific Park experienced. So a change in Black and Hispanic populations, rising incomes, rising educational attainment, and rising housing costs. And so we can get back to you on what we have for that specific census tracts that pick up Pacific Park. But that was one of the reasons why we wanted to show the larger surrounding area, is that there seems to be a larger underlying trend in almost all of this portion of Brooklyn that is experiencing similar trajectories.
thank you, Alex. I hope we are definitely going, as we asked when we saw the preview, that we will get a copy to share with the Land Use Committee. Copy of Amy's presentation. Amy, is that okay?
Yeah,
Winston?
definitely. I just need to update that one slide that Gib pointed out with the wrong talking points. Thank you very much for spotting that. But I'll share it with you sometime tomorrow.
I appreciate it. Okay. So I'm looking for more questions and I'm not seeing any. So we will be getting back to everyone, all 48 people who remain on the line, and the remainder of the other 56 or 59 that were on originally, with a follow-up date to do further community outreach on this. And I'm wondering if the neighbors which live near the project, I understand there's no place called North Prospect Heights, would be attending so they can get the answers to the questions we get covered with during our normal land use committee meetings. So unless there's anything else, I am preparing to close the meeting.
Ethel, sorry to interrupt. Did we respond to Phil Godson's question about the lag in data? That's the one that was submitted right before Aaron's question.
Can you recite? Is he still on? Can he ask his question? Mr. Dodson, are you on? I'm not seeing the question. I'm going back into the chat. I'm not seeing the question. Can you recite the question, please, Jonah?
Problem. So when will we see the data that reflects changes from the pandemic, and how long is the lag between, before we collect and share the data?
Well, that's why it's really great to schedule a pandemic in a year of a census.
You know, I'll take a quick crack at responding to this, just because, and I'll turn it over to the rest of to Amy and Winston and others. I think this has been a real challenge for us. As you know, we started this work towards the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of uncertainty about what happened. And now that we're, 9 months or so into it, we're starting to collect some data. The challenge with the ACS data, which is our most comprehensive source, is that it's sample based. It's done over extended periods of time, and the most recent set we have is from 2018. So, and then that doesn't even account for the issues that the census is having now with the 10 years decennial one. So with respect to that, I think, we do recognize that, and we're trying to take as much data that we have. And as Amy showed, we do have some information about, transportation related changes, some job changes. So as much as we can share that, we'll take that back. And with respect to how we collect and share the data, it really varies by the source. So the way the ACS collects it is different than the Department of Labor, which we use for some. So I don't know if it's worth getting into those details, but we're happy to provide more information.
Thank you, Jonah. I think this is a wonderful confluence to have the census ending up just when we need to be able to do a retrospective in order to prognosticate what we should be doing. What is DCP's normal excuse for telling DEP and any of the other public benefit services we get from Con Ed and companies like Verizon that we're looking at a population explosion? Does DCP have a standard percentage of population growth expected before it will say, look, you need to be putting in new infrastructure of this type and that type?
It's a great question, Ethel. I'll start, and I think, I'm sure Winston and others will have thoughts on this. I would say that there's a lot of information sharing that we do, set apart from neighborhood planning work. So we're feeding information about expected growth to the school construction authority, for example, that they use to account for changes in school seat capacity and forecasting that need, which, and then, I think a lot of the work, that we're doing, there's a part of it that's, in the environmental review work that does get fed into what other agencies expect. And I would say that planning for infrastructure is something that is constantly happening with or without rezoning. So a lot of agencies like DEP or Con Ed are closely looking at, DOB, Department of Buildings data and permits that are being pulled and changes in population. So it's a constant method of sharing information. But when we do neighborhood planning work, it's like almost an extra layer on top of that, especially if we're undertaking an environmental impact statement where we're doing a more comprehensive study of these things and then directly sharing that information with different agencies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Completely agree with what Jonah is saying. We don't all work in the city in a vacuum. In fact, I always like to say that there are 300,000 civil servants focused like laser beams on their area of expertise. So while we are the planning department and we gather information and we know about land use and land use trends, we share that information. But also DEP works, they monitor where their sewers and water lines are being taxed, Department of Education, Parks Department. Every single agency has planners employed looking to understand trends. And I would also emphasize that oftentimes these trends are more gradual, right? The population doesn't go from 0 to 100 inside of 1 and 2 years. It changes gradually, even though sometimes that change may appear to be very fast or rapid, or tall building goes up. But if you spread it out over a larger area or larger borough or the entire city, it actually becomes more regular and more gradual.
Thank you. I'm looking for more questions. Okay.
While we're waiting for more questions, I just wanted to once again thank Amy and DCP for putting this presentation together. And I hope the folks who are joining us tonight have found it informative and useful in terms of understanding what's going on in this part of Brooklyn. We have a lot of people who are on this meeting who are probably attending an MCROWN meeting for the first time, who may not. I don't think we made any attempt to really explain what MCROWN is, and we're not going to go into it in exhaustive detail now. But I did want to say that if you are interested in participating in a discussion going forward about how Community Board Aid is trying to affect or address some of the trends you've been hearing about through district, you're welcome to join us on an ongoing basis for these meetings. And if you email me at give@bocconi.com, I typed it in the chat before, I will add you to the MCROWN distribution list. and you will get notices of future meetings. But just very briefly, MCROWN is a community board 8 plan to rezone an area roughly between Franklin Avenue and Grand Avenue and Bergen Street and Atlantic Avenue, with another finger stretching along the south side of Atlantic Avenue to Vanderbilt. That's currently zoned M11, but we believe has potential not only for housing, but also for jobs, including jobs of the type and for people who are exactly those who appear to be getting pushed out of this neighborhood. So encourage you to join us if you find this interesting and would like to participate in the discussion. And I think I see a question from Ed Lai about are the crime statistics available for this period of time. I think the answer to that question is probably yes, but from the police department, I don't know to what extent city planning analyzes crime statistics.
Yeah, so that data is by precinct, and we can definitely take a look. We can also take a look at things like transportation crashes and other sort of transportation related data. But yeah, like Gib mentioned, this is sort of NYPD data.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Gib.
So Ethel, I just wanted to pick up on something Gib was mentioning before, the data and the trends. So the MCROWN area, because you would have mandatory inclusionary housing and because there's 4 options that can be tied to the zoning in terms of the level of affordability, this information that city planning is presenting tonight should be helpful to the community board and the community at large in thinking about what household types they would best want to serve, which incomes are in most in need to try to remain in the neighborhood and whatever other community objectives there are. You see what's happening, and here's a chance to intervene to a certain extent.
Thank you, Richard. That is very, very true. We should throw in some more tax exemptions for developers who want to give a higher percentage of their apartments a lower rental rate. So that would be great, but unlikely to happen. But at any rate, again, we're approaching 10 minutes to 8. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I'm prepared to close the meeting. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Amy for her wonderful compendium of data. That's a lot of work. We look forward to getting a copy. So the entire DCP team has been very, very helpful and informative on this. And I hope we can use this information to move the project along with a little bit more speed and conviction. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethel.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.